Bom dia, pessoal. Que alegria ter vocês aqui com a gente nessa manhã. Meu nome é Issaaf, eu sou uma das coordenadoras do GP Tecnologias e Culturas Digitais da Intercom, que hoje é a casa do evento Os Usos dos Métodos Digitais, um evento que vai durar de agora até as 13h. A gente agradece, inclusive, a paciência de vocês com o nosso tempinho. E a gente está muito feliz de receber esse evento internacional aqui, uma organização coletiva, e vou chamar para o palco para contar mais sobre o evento dos usos dos métodos digitais a Lorena Caminhas, que é uma das organizadoras da atividade de hoje, que vai apresentar para vocês nossos palestrantes e conduzir essa mesa da manhã. Lorena, obrigada, é uma alegria receber você e ser a casa desse evento tão importante.
Bom dia, tá dando bom dia em português, e daqui para frente, pessoal, a gente vai falar inglês, nós já temos os nossos convidados aqui, então espero que vocês possam acompanhar, e eu vou fazer um pouquinho em inglês, português, para todo mundo ficar incluído. So, good morning, everyone. We are really happy to have you all here. We want to welcome you on behalf of the organization team, Lorena Caminhas, Issaaf, Karhawi, and Carolina Parreiras from USP. And we are really happy to host this online seminar on the uses of digital methods and to have many brilliant scholars with us today to discuss how to combine digital methods and qualitative research. And the first thing I want to say is that we want this seminar to be accessible to everybody, and that's why we are going to introduce the scholars in English and in Portuguese, just to make it easier for everybody who is watching us right now. So, but then I have to say this, presentations and discussions, the opening and the first session is going to be in English, of course, but then you can re-watch this in another moment if you need it. And the last thing before we start this seminar off, for those who are following us on YouTube, if you have your questions, please send to us on the chat, and we are going to take a look on that all the time, and then we can share with the presenters. And for our opening, I'm really, really happy to have Thomas Poell with us today, and he's going to be presenting the table titled Digital Methods in the Platform Age. Thomas is professor of data, culture, and institutions at the University of Amsterdam. He is the program director of the MA in Media Studies, co-founder of the research priority area Global Digital Cultures, and faculty lead for the National Human AI and Datafied Society Sector Plan. In recent years, he has built a conceptual framework to analyze how platforms and AI are reshaping the cultural industries. I'm just going to introduce Thomas in Portuguese, and then the stage is going to be yours, Thomas. So, Thomas é professor de dados, cultura e instituições da Universidade de Amsterdã. Ele é o diretor do programa de mestrado em estudos de mídia, é cofundador da área prioritária em estudos globais da cultura digital e é o líder, né, desse projeto nacional de humanidades e AI e humanidades na sociedade datificada. Nos anos recentes, ele trabalhou, né, e tem construído um quadro, né, um enquadramento conceitual para pensar plataformas e inteligência artificial e as mudanças que essas tecnologias têm trazido para as indústrias culturais. So, thank you, Thomas, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Lorena and Issaaf, for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. Let me just somehow have another sound on, just because I opened it. Maybe I need to leave there. All right. Now I also opened the session on my phone, so that's why I got sounds from multiple sources. So in a moment, I will share my presentation. If at any point things are unclear or there are particular questions, please interrupt me. I'll try to speak for about 25 minutes. And then I hope there's time for Q&A of about 15 minutes or so. So let me start by sharing my screen, and then we can get going. All right. Present, share screen. I think that's... So can you see this? Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Yeah,
perfect.
it's perfect.
All right, nice. Okay. Let me see. Okay. Are you still seeing my screen? Yes? All right. Okay, so this is a presentation on, I've now called it Platforms, Activism, and Digital Methods. So it builds on research I've done over the last 10, 15 years or so around online activism, but I also reflect on this in relation to more recent research I've done on platforms, and especially pertaining to cultural production, but a lot of the insights there can be shared or can be applied also to questions around activism. All right, so this is the structure of the lecture. By the way, you can see a QR code here on the screen, on the slide, where you can find my page, where all of the publications which I'm referencing are also mentioned, and some of them can actually be downloaded. So what I want to do is provide you with a discussion of digital methods, but especially also mixed methods. So I'm reflecting on how to work with especially Twitter and Facebook data sets pertaining to protest hashtags and protest pages. But I've combined that research with semi-structured interviews with key activists. And especially that combination of methods, I think, is very useful and important. So interviews and ethnographic research allow for sort of contextualization, and vice versa. The type of quantitative research that's possible with digital methods allows for a much more sort of comprehensive understanding of the phenomena which you're looking at. So both are important and both are complementary. But before I dive into the digital methods / interview part of the research, the really sort of applied part, I first want to reflect briefly on the larger platform ecosystem in which activism is today situated. And I think that's helpful for thinking through particular forms of online activism. All right, so the first part especially then draws from these two books, which I've published over the last couple of years with some colleagues. And the first one is the Platform Society with my colleague José van Dijk and Martijn de Waal, and the latter one is Platforms and Culture Production. I'll especially draw from the latter one, where we really analyzed the mechanisms at play in platform markets, infrastructures, and governance. So I'll get to that in a moment. So the first thing I think to think about is whether you look at activism or questions around cultural production, which I've been working on over the last couple of years, is this process of what we call platformization, which is not a top-down process, but one that's constituted through the constant interaction between platforms, end users, and societal actors. So is through that type of interaction that content becomes visible, that content is sometimes also monetized and is governed in all sorts of ways. And we have defined this notion of platformization as a process, first related to culture production, but here I've applied it to activism because I wanted to talk about activism today because that's where most of my digital methods research is focused on. So we defined it as the penetration of digital platforms' economic, infrastructural, and governmental extensions into contemporary social movements, as well as the organization of activist practices of mobilization, organization, and communication around platforms. And one thing I think to think about, especially when you're working on questions of activism, is that in a platform age, communication in many ways is organization. So, for example, things like hashtags, pages, also exchanging, for example, protest memes becomes a form of organization. So these things are very sort of interrelated. Then sort of when we think about platformization, obviously we want to also think about what is a platform then. Building on a variety of different disciplines, we have started to think about platforms as computational or data infrastructures that then facilitate, aggregate, monetize, and govern interactions between end users, content, and service providers. So that builds on work in business studies, critical political economy, and software studies, especially understanding then platforms from this more institutional angle, right, as infrastructures and markets and governance frameworks. So thinking about this process of platformization, it's just important to keep in mind that platformization is not the same as digitization. So digitization, you could say, is the more broader process, and platformization is more specific to a particular form of online organization, exchange, also a particular type of infrastructure. So I usually give the example of the New York Times or Netflix, which collect lots of data, also use sophisticated algorithms to curate content, but which are not platform companies. They should rather be labeled as media or entertainment companies that primarily produce or license original content, and which are, and that's the key part, are not directly economically and infrastructurally open or accessible to third parties. So activists, whether individual activists or activist movements, big or small, have been very attracted, obviously, to platforms because they are infrastructurally and economically relatively open, which means that these actors can share content to quite large audiences through platforms. Okay, so that openness has initially, in the early 2000s, been very much understood from what you could say a democratization or emancipatory or participatory culture perspective. So in a way, these platforms were considered as almost perfect instruments for activist mobilization, organization, and communication. So that's about now something like 15 to 20 years ago that framing was quite prevalent. So while that early framing has been extensively and rightfully so criticized, it is very important to keep in mind that platforms still do and have provided new opportunities for activists, right, to find audiences, mobilize people, coordinate activities, just as they have for many cultural producers, right? So in that sense, the opportunities provided by platforms are an important part of the process of platformization, and also should not be dismissed because it's an important angle to understand the drawing power of platforms, why activists are flocking or embracing platforms, right? They that is an important explanation for sort of the drive towards platforms. But of course, as I already said, that democratization interpretation of platforms has been extensively criticized, and I've also done that in my work with my colleagues. We've greatly complicated that story of empowerment. And what we've pointed out is that platforms are not simply matchmakers, neutral intermediaries, but instead they are incredibly powerful economic and financial actors in their own right. And that's to do with the way in which their infrastructures are governed, which I'll say a little bit about, but it's especially also the result of how platforms work as markets, and they work more specifically as multi-sided markets, which are subject to so-called network effects. And quite, well, straightforward or simple explanation of this is the moment a platform draws a lot of end users, it becomes more attractive for other end users. So if your friends, family, colleagues, and so on are on a platform, the platform becomes more attractive for you as a user to try to distribute your content through that platform. So the more end users then join a platform, the more attractive it subsequently becomes for content and service providers, as they have a larger audience to target. And the same, of course, applies to advertisers who also want to have large audiences. So these mechanisms reinforce each other. So in that sense, you can see what we call network effects on these platforms. At the moment they are successful in drawing these different sides of the market, so end users, content and service providers, advertisers, data intermediaries, and so on, to the platform. They set up what you could call winner-take-all effect. So the platforms that succeed at that tend to become very dominant. So that's also what we see, right? In many sectors, we see that one or two, sometimes three platforms tend to dominate a particular sector. So YouTube dominates video sharing, or TikTok dominates the short video, or Google dominates search. And that also then means that these platforms, these dominant platforms, become almost unavoidable for third parties, for actors that need to share their content or try to share their content with large audiences. So that's also true for activists, right? So they are unavoidable for these actors, but it also creates sort of these fundamental tensions, because many activists are really uncomfortable with the hyper commercial nature and also the aesthetics of these platforms, as well as how they're governed. But they're kind of forced to work through them to be able to communicate and mobilize larger audiences. Important also then to observe is that winner-take-all dynamics are not just at play between platforms, but they also occur within platform markets or on platforms. So content that generates a lot of engagement tends to become really very visible, and that corresponds with the business model of these platforms, which try to keep users engaged. So that means then that, for example, in the case of a protest like Black Lives Matter or the Occupy protest, for example, we could see that these protests became indeed very visible, generating lots of user engagement. But we also saw that it is very difficult to sustain that visibility in the longer term. Because you need kind of that viral attention to keep your content very visible. And to do that, you need, in the longer term, substantial resources. So, for example, brand recognition, data analytics tools, sometimes also support in terms of talent development, and so on. So that means often with these protest movements, like Black Lives Matter or Occupy, that they become very visible at particular moments, but then are subsequently, start to dissipate the moment a new trending set of topics sort of flows through the platform ecosystem. So that's an interesting and complicated dynamic. So for for activist organizations, it means, or activist movements, it means that they really need to build a very strong social movement organization to be able to sustain activity in the longer term, both visibility, but also to keep a movement together. So that requires indeed substantial resources, but overall, if you look at the platform ecosystem, especially legacy media organizations, like, for example, the New York Times, which I mentioned before, Disney, Bloomberg, News Corp, so some of these US organizations, they have become very successful sort of in achieving visibility in these in that online environment. And in that sense, you can actually see, rather than democratization and empowerment, where more and more actors, and especially sort of alternative actors, can become visible. Instead, what you see is much more of a concentration of attention and concentration, basically, of resources in these more legacy organizations, as well as, of course, a concentration of control over the online media ecosystem in a few platform companies that in all sorts of ways govern the content that flows through these platforms, right? So they curate content through algorithms, and sometimes also through editorial curation. They moderate content, so they remove particular content or shadow ban certain content, and they set all sorts of standards through community guidelines, but also by, for example, setting standards to the kinds of content that can be shared through a platform. All right, so that's the first part, right? So, these considerations about the platform ecosystem, which rather than leading to a democratization of public communication and rather than an empowerment of marginal social actors, actually a concentration of political and economic power, both in legacy media companies as well as in these new sort of platform companies that shape that environment. And what I want to do now is think more specifically about digital methods in relation to platform-based activism. So within that environment, which I just sketched, and then think about digital methods research in combination with interviews. And so that research has generated some new ideas about protest leadership and online and the way in which that functions in these online environments. That work is especially, or what I'm presenting now is especially based on two publications. I probably published about 10, 12 papers around sort of questions of platforms and activism, but I want to focus now on these two. And the first one's on Twitter as a multilingual space. And here I especially want to reflect on the use and the importance of interviews. And the second one is on protest leadership, which looks at the Egyptian uprising of early 2011. And that especially is a reflection on how to work with social media data. By the way, both projects, as you can see, have been done with colleagues who also speak the language of the particular region in which the research was taking place. So that's Tunisia and Egypt, and had already done research on those regions. And I think that's very important for doing this type of research. So working with social media data, doing digital methods, it is important to keep in mind that there is a lot of data available, potentially, although sort of access become more limited over the years, which offers a lot of options for analysis, but a lot of those options are predefined sort of in the data already. The data is already quite structured. And over the structuring of that data, the researchers have relatively little influence. So that means that sort of classic sort of waterfall type research strategies do not necessarily work, right? So working with a precise research question, then data collection, and then trying to find answers, that's not how digital methods research really usually operates. It's instead, you often start with a little bit more of an open-ended analysis and do some what you could call numerical detective work. So almost like a conversation with the data. So let me show how that works and how that can also be combined with interviews. So the first case I wanted to briefly focus on is the Tunisian uprising of early 2011. and that uprising was, among others, led to quite a lot of communication on Twitter around this particular hashtag, Sidi Bouzid, and which was quite active around from 18th of December 2010 to the 15th of January 2011, when I don't know whether you have any memory of that uprising, when President Ben Ali of Tunisia fled after 23 years of rule. We collected in total 100,000 tweets sent by 12,000 users. Many of those users, by the way, were not located in Tunisia itself, but actually elsewhere. So we're thinking about 10% of those were actually located in Tunisia, which means that a large part of what we were looking at was a transnational social media communication. And for us, it was especially interesting that much of the communication took place in English, French, and Tunisian, and then Tunisian Arabic, obviously. And it consisted of news about protests, about responses to the Tunisian army, but also reflections about international politics and about social media themselves. And we were especially intrigued by this use of these three languages, so English, French, and Tunisian Arabic. Also interesting is that many of the most active users were institutionally embedded. For example, in this particular organization, Global Voices, an international network of bloggers. So one of these users, Sami Ben-Gabia, tweeted also in these three languages which we detected. So 102 tweets in Arabic, 170 in English, and then 69 in French. And the question really became for us, why were they using these very different languages? And that was true, it turned out, for almost all of the top 500 most active users in this Twitter hash set. So what we found is that these languages were actually used strategically. So Sami Ben-Gabia, who we interviewed, said, well, in English, we mostly tweet about news and facts, no debates. We also tweet about human rights, since this issue makes a lot of noise in the West. We use French, mostly to criticize and insult the French because of their cowardness at the beginning of the revolution. And for us, classic Arabic was more important than the Tunisian dialect. We wanted the rest of the Arabs to understand us and our actions. Even when we communicate with Tunisians, we use classical Arabic. We're thinking it's a matter that concerns all Arabs. And the Tunisian dialect is only used if we consider the tweeted information of a local matter. About 20 to 30% of our communication is in the Tunisian dialect, mostly to make jokes and use irony, so to keep the spirits high. But the important message here is not so much sort of about this language use, but about that this type of insight is only really possible through interviews. So we notice this use of language in the Twitter analysis. We could only get it, sort of the why people were doing this, through interviews. And that the same applies for insights we subsequently developed about sort of the organization behind the Twitter communication, which turned out to be already in place or being developed for about a decade before that, first through the Arab blogosphere and subsequently through social media platforms. So another user we interviewed, also very active, Nessa Badadi, who argued that Twitter at that time, so this is 2010 and a little bit before that, was especially used as a recruiting tool to get young Arabic activists sort of engaged in a larger network. And it was also used strategically to target Western media to get sort of the message out. So you can see that here. I'm hurrying up a little bit because I don't want to run too much over time. So what he's saying here is that they've been working for years on developing a strategy that sort of includes the complete media machine, understanding relations between different types of media, and then identifying and recruiting and influencing correspondents. So the message then is really, so digital methods research is crucial to understand sort of patterns, especially in this particular case around language. But then you really need these kind of interviews to give sort of depth and meaning, and also answer why questions about the particular strategies that were employed in that communication. Well, the second case I just want to very briefly touch on, because I'm running out of time, is the Colina Khaled Said Facebook page, which played quite an important role in the lead up to the protest in Egypt, which almost completely directly followed on the Tunisian protest, were also inspired by the Tunisian protest. And this is a Facebook page, so quite a big one actually, which in the end had about 4 million likes. And what we did here is, and I just wanted to briefly sort of walk you through this, did this kind of sort of detective work, this dialogue with the data, where we first look at larger patterns of social media activity. So you can see a graph of the first year of the page, where you can see a limited activity in the beginning and then huge peaks of activity around the major protests that took place at the end of January 2011, and especially around the moment Mubarak, the long-term dictator in Egypt, stepped down as president. And so through that sort of so these kinds of overviews, you can get a sense of the kind of data you're looking at. And subsequently, we started to look into the comments that were shared through the page, as well as the posts on the page. So these Facebook pages are kind of hierarchical sort of structures, where page admins can share particular messages, and then users can comment on those messages. So this is so we initially looked at the total set of user posts and the total set of comments. So those were 14,000 page posts by the admins, and about 7 million comments. So a very large set. And there, that's the type of sort of inquiry which really looks at keywords. So initially, there was a lot of attention for questions around torture, because the page was created because a particular young man, Khaled Said, had a run-in with the police and was tortured to death in that encounter. And then that set off a huge protest wave, where people were dismayed by this, because it was quite sort of indicative of the way in which the police was sort of keeping public peace, if you can say. Well, don't think that's the right word to say here. But over time, sort of comments started to more broadly question the corruption of the regime at large, and also eventually started to ask for the resignation of the regime, and especially of President Mubarak. So we did that kind of more quantitative analysis, and then eventually we started looking more in depth into the comments that were generating a lot of engagement around, so comments and posts that were generating a lot of engagement, so that were of interest to users. And there we developed a qualitative analysis. So I'm just going to skip this and just briefly a couple of points here. So this allowed us to try to gain insight in that dynamic of exchange between the page admins and the users. And one thing that became very interesting to us in that research is that the page admins developed into what you could call something like informational or communicative, or what we eventually called connective leaders, that were really sort of structuring the way in which that communication took place, and that eventually also had quite a lot of impact on the mobilization and communication, at least in the first phase of the protests that were taking place. In that sense, we saw a lot of similarities with the most active users in the Twitter hashtag set, which we looked at for Tunisia. So I'm going to skip this and then eventually come to this slide where we systematize these differences between what has been recognized as social movement leadership, more traditional forms of leadership, and this connective form of leadership, which really was types of insight we developed by a combination of doing this social media, this quantitative and qualitative social media data analysis, as well as interviews. And here you can see some of these differences which we note between these types of leadership, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. So then, to conclude, so when doing digital methods research, it is vital, first of all, to be critically aware of the platform, or you could say even broader, the media ecosystem in which the examined activity is situated. This ecosystem very much sets the horizon of opportunity for activists, as it also does for cultural producers. The second point I think it's very important to be aware of is to be open to entering into a dialogue with the data, to do numerical detective work, and then be sort of sensitive to what is striking and remarkable about the data. So in the case of the Twitter set, we were very intrigued by the use of language, whereas eventually also the question of leadership came into view when we started to look into the Facebook page and the Egyptian uprising. And then finally, it is very important to complement this type of data-driven research or detective work with interviews or ethnographic or contextual research to try to understand the specific social, economic, and cultural, political cultural settings in which the activity which you're studying, whether it's activism or cultural production, is situated. So the types of insights which we developed on the use of language or leadership were only possible because of this sort of more qualitative contextual research and interviews that do require people that actually speak the language and know that particular context. So thank you very much. I think I'm now at half an hour, so I think that's also time to stop the presentation.
Yeah, hi everyone. We're back. Thank you, Thomas, for your presentation. So we're gonna have like 10 minutes for our Q&A. And I'm gonna start with my own questions. And then if anyone in the chat wants to send us questions in Portuguese or in English, feel free to do so. So first of all, I'm going to just check in, and most of our audience today is of Brazilian researchers. So, and for that, I want to ask you, Thomas, there's a specific question of how to handle large data sets for beginners, because we need to assume that most people that are watching us are not really dealing with this kind of data set for longer. So how what would you say, like, what are the tips that you can give them?
Yeah. All right. So it goes back to the central points I was trying to make in this talk. So the first thing is obviously to get the data, which is not always that easy, right? So having access to APIs, for example, is more limited now. And so let's say that you have now access to that data. So pretty simple ways to deal with it is, if you're a beginner, is to enter that data into a spreadsheet, and then you can do a couple of things, right? So the first thing is maybe to look into the type of content or type of users that have generated a lot of engagement. So that's one way to sort of deal with sort of very large sets, because you can't really look at the entire set, and it doesn't really make much sense to look at the entire set anyway, because in contrast to sort of mainstream content, social media content or platform content is often not pre-filtered, right? So anyone can basically share content, which means that there's a lot of content which might not be that relevant for people. So you actually want to identify the types of content that are of specific relevance to people. And that can be, for example, identified by numbers of comments or numbers of likes, or the number of times it's shared, if you have that type of those types of sort of metrics. So that is really one way to do it, and to understand, and then subsequently do qualitative analysis on that engagement content. So that's a bit different from how you would approach, for example, content that is in a newspaper or on a television channel, where you in principle assume that it's been seen by a very large group of people, and that it has been considered, at least by those that are the editors of that content, to be relevant, right? With social media data, you take a somewhat different approach. You actually assume that not necessarily all content is that relevant, and then you focus on the stuff that's really generates a lot of engagement. That's one, I think, important strategy. The other important strategy, which I also briefly touched on, is to look at entire sets, and then start looking, for example, at keywords. So how much does a particular word, like, for example, in the set, we had a very large set, right, of comments, so 7 million comments, 14,000 posts by the admins in the case of the Egyptian Facebook page. And there's no way you can read that content and analyze it. So we started to look into sort of frequency of particular types of words, and then look at how that changed over time. And then we saw sort of a transition from torture to sort of questions around corruption, which indeed sort of corresponds also with larger trends in sort of the political discourse around these protests and in relation to the Mubarak regime. So that's another way. And then if you go beyond that, I think it's very important to start collaborating with people who have experience in data science work, so who have a computational background, and really collaborate. So more generally, maybe another thing to emphasize, so especially the project on the Egyptian case was a collaboration with somebody who, or actually a couple of people who studied and spoke Arabic, sort of Arabic language, and studied also Egyptian history and culture, as well as with computer scientists. So it's really through that type of collaboration that you can then do more sophisticated and advanced analysis. And of course, in the case of Egypt, was also important for me, because I don't speak Arabic or read it, that I work with people who actually do. So also seek collaboration. So many social media data projects, many data digital methods projects are collaborative projects. So that's also important to keep in mind.
So, yeah, I just have one more question, and then I'll pass it on to Issaaf if she wants to ask something. It's just related to this question that I just asked you. I would like you to expand a little bit more, if you can, about the organization of the whole research, and when and how and do you decided like to start with digital methods and then move on to the interviews, and who you decided to interview. If you can just give us a broader sense of how to organize like those different phases of the research with digital methods and then qualitative research.
Yeah. So so I was already very much interested and had done historical work on protests and some demonstrations, strikes, also revolution in the past. So in my when I started sort of being engaged with digital methods, I noticed obviously that a lot of protest communication was taking place through these social media platforms. So then social media data became very interesting. And a lot of that has often to do with the things that are unfolding and are of interest to you, right? That matter to you. So I was, I had colleagues in the Middle East who were very concerned about the protests that were happening or engaged in those protests. So that became a very important sort of event at that time to do research on and try to understand sort of these, at that time, relatively new forms of communication, organization, mobilization through these platforms. So what was happening and how were platforms involved in this, and how did a variety of different types of users started to employ these platforms? So in digital methods was the ideal way sort of to gain insight or at least get data, right? So about who was sharing what, and do sort of more systematic analysis of that data. So at that time, it was quite still relatively easy to get platform data through APIs, which were still relatively open. So it was the decision to work on particular protests mostly because those protests were happening and we were interested or concerned about these protests and wanted to understand how that unfolded, also sort of as a political and social responsibility as researchers. And I was also specifically concerned about sort of that these were commercial platforms, and that what that means in terms of how that type of communication is being structured. But then doing that type of research, I also ran into the limits of digital methods research, right? So the limit has a lot to do with understanding the cultural, political, historical context of whatever you are studying. So the data, social media data or platform data tends to be a little bit decontextualized. So you get it as a data set, right? You enter it into a spreadsheet and then you start analyzing it. But it's if you don't know that context very well, it's easy or it's very risky to misinterpret that data, right? To interpret in ways that are problematic, that are not corresponding with the way in which that's actually understood within that context. Like things like irony and references, which are not explained, are always there in the data. And especially if you work with content that is not in a language which you speak yourself, relying, for example, on automated translation is really problematic. You really need sort of that understanding. So that's why I started to combine it with interviews and sort of more sort of contextual research and working with area specialists, right? In the Egyptian case, Tunisian case, I did similar type of research in India and in China, in each case really working with regional sort of specialists.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Thomas, for your talk. It was awesome to listen to you and have some ideas of how to do digital research. And I would like to ask you about ethical concerns, especially because you mentioned the connective leadership, that is usually an anonymous person who is trying to not get high visibility, probably even because of maybe getting into risk. So I'd like to listen about those things and how do we have to deal with ethical concerns on digital research.
Yeah, so that's obviously a huge issue. That was a huge issue for both of these research projects, which I talked to the Tunisian and the Egyptian one. So what we did, obviously, first step is to get your project, apply for ethics approval with your ethics committee at your university, which has a lot of experience in dealing with sort of these issues. So that's important. We do that now systematically at the University of Amsterdam. And that's now also required for many journals in which you would potentially publish research, right? They want to see ethics approval. So that's the first thing. Within sort of dealing with this type of data, we made 100% sure that it was anonymized. So we anonymized. So we took out the user hashtag, the user account names when analyzing the data also. Not just when publishing online, but analyzing the data. But then, of course, once you start doing interviews and looking at sort of contextualizing that material, we spoke to people, right? And that's no longer anonymous. And there, so we in that sense, we've for this project, actually, the Tunisian one, only spoke to people who were already publicly very visible, and which are, by the way, were all at that point outside of Tunisia, right? So they were in the sort of diaspora in the US, in Europe, and they were already publicly very sort of visible and connected, and were appearing on television and those kind of things. And then we asked whether they would be okay to share their name in the publication. In some cases, we actually have chosen not to do this at all, right? To anonymize all of the people we have interviewed. But actually, in these kind of cases, activists actually tend to be quite explicit that they want to be also in name part of the project, because it's part of their activism, right? To share this kind of these kind of insights. So, but that's always sort of a very complicated issue which you have to deal with. But so with the highly visible people, which you could also see in my presentation, we did share their names. They're also in the publication. But that was really also an insistence on these people we interviewed. But more generally, for users, regular social media use, you always anonymize their account names, and usually also you then start paraphrasing their messages, right? Because it would still be possible to find those messages online. So it's a big issue. I do have to say, I have to admit also that when we started doing this research in 2011, 2012, and a couple of years after that, so these ethical questions were less sort of central to the research community. We've become much more careful over the years. So I would certainly emphasize that it's just very important to work through with an ethics committee and then anonymize your content and paraphrase social media content.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you.
So that's it for this opening session. Thank you, Thomas, for your presentation and for all the answers to all those questions.
Yeah.
And we are going to have a break of 10 minutes, and we are going to be back soon for the next session. Pessoal, nós vamos ter intervalinho de 10 minutos e em 10 minutinhos estaremos de volta com a próxima mesa. Obrigada por todo mundo que está acompanhando.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you.
Olá, pessoal, estamos de volta com a segunda sessão do nosso seminário. E estamos todos nos organizando aqui para dar início. Já temos Carol conosco.
Bom dia, todos, todas e todes. Prazer enorme estar aqui. Eu sou Carol Parreiras, pesquisadora do Departamento de Antropologia da USP, coordenadora do LETEC, Laboratório Etnográfico de Estudos Tecnológicos e Digitais, parceiro desse evento. Agradeço enormemente a Lorena e a Issaaf por esse convite para estar aqui. E eu vou apresentar em português as nossas duas participantes, que nessa nossa segunda, nossa primeira sessão, a gente teve a Palestrante, chamada Os Métodos Digitais para o Estudo da Cultura Digital, e a gente vai ter a participação da Lucia Bainotti, da Universidade de Amsterdã, e da Emilija Jokubauskaite. Sorry if I said it wrong.
It's good.
Também da Universidade de Amsterdã. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm really looking forward to hear you too.
Hi, guys. Yeah, I'm going to do this presentation. It's going to be really brief, just in English, just to say hi. Good morning from Brazil to you, Lucia and Emilija. It's afternoon in Amsterdam, I know, but this is morning still in Brazil. So thank you very much for being with us today and present those amazing research with us. So the first presentation is going to be Lucia, and then we're going to go to Emilija. Just to present our speakers today, Lucia Bainotti is assistant professor in digital and visual media analysis at the Department of Media Studies of the University of Amsterdam and the postdoctoral researcher in the So Big Data Plus project. Her main research interest revolves around visual digital methods, digital consumer culture, and platformization thereof, and technology facilitator gender-based violence. She is co-author of the platformization of consumer culture. So in Lucia, Lucia's presentation is going to be studying ephemerality and ephemeral content with digital methods. I'm going to pass the mic to Lucia, and then we're going to have time, and then I'll introduce Emilija and her presentation. So Lucia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Can you just confirm that you can hear me well and see the slides?
Yeah, we can hear you and see the slides perfect.
So I had some problem uploading the slides, so I hope that the template is not messed up completely, but hopefully this will work. Thank you so much again. It's really a pleasure to be here. And today I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the previous work that I've done and some of work that I'm conducting at the moment. And the main focus is on ephemeral content and ephemerality more broadly. What I would like to do today is to start with a little bit of an introduction about ephemerality and what we can consider as ephemeral content, and then focus on one particular type of ephemerality, as I will argue later on, by focusing on TikTok and TikTok videos. And later on, try to guide you through some methodological choices when dealing with this type of content, and then present a brief case study from some of my research. So when I was preparing for this talk, I really went back to reflect on ephemerality and what it means. And if we look at dictionary's definition, by looking at ephemerality is not very helpful because it tells us that it's the quality or state of being ephemeral. And so if we look at what ephemeral means, then it is something that lasts from a very short time, something that dies in a few days. And this is the starting point for a reflection on ephemerality on social media and digital platforms more broadly. When we talk about ephemerality, we usually talk about content that disappears after a certain amount of time. And this is not just in the definition that we can see from, for example, the Merriam-Webster dictionary, but also if we look at social media content such as Instagram stories or Snapchat content, but also WhatsApp statuses, and to some extent YouTube experimented in the past with ephemeral content in itself with the story format on there as well. And so this is the first type of content that we can see when we think about ephemerality. And this is also the starting point of my research. Together with some of the colleagues in Italy, we developed some methods for the study of Instagram stories that you can see in this publication here. But then after a while, I kept on reflecting on the type of platforms that have been emerging over the years and how they promote and allow users to present and share different type of content that is still fleeting, that is still transient, but perhaps in different ways. And so throughout my research, I've encountered different types of ephemeralities. And the argument that I want to make here and what I'm going to present is that we can understand ephemerality as a multidimensional kind of concept. And I identified mostly 3 ways in which we can understand ephemerality. The first one is, as I said, in terms of disappearing content, such as the content that we can see in Instagram stories, but we can also understand ephemerality as algorithmically ranked and mediated content, such as in the case of TikTok videos. And also, if you wish, we can understand moderated content, so content that disappears due to moderation also is a form of ephemerality. And in this talk today, I would like to focus specifically on the second point. So how can we conceive TikTok content or short video content as a form of ephemeral content? If we take a step back, we can reflect on this new form of ephemerality starting from a platform such as Instagram. Instagram, beyond the story format, has been defined by previous scholars as a sort of image machine because the platform offers a flow of images that are always live and ephemeral. The authors that are mentioned here really argue that precisely because images receive attention on Instagram within the first several hours or even several minutes after being posted, then can they be considered as disappearing from view. And so the authors argue that users in a way navigate this constant flow of images by scrolling through the screen and using their fingers. And this is a definition and a description of Instagram that is from 2015 and in a way applies, and it is even more true for a platform such as TikTok. And indeed, if we think about TikTok, we can consider it not only as an email machine, but really as a scrolling machine. On TikTok, we have obviously a very large quantity of video content that to some extent is with a limited permanence on the For You page. And because it has a volatile visibility that is exactly related to the platform's logic and the platform's algorithmic curation. But also, if we think about a platform like TikTok, that I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, we can consider one of the most popular content on the platform, and the fact that it is organized in challenges, right? The affordances of the platform and the algorithmic ranking of content invites and promotes the idea of trends. And so users are engaged and invited to participate in trends and reproducing the same and mimetic content all over again, right? And we can see, therefore, that challenges in themselves can be considered a sort of a fleeting object because they become very popular and then their popularity and their content slowly fades away. So I would claim here that TikTok challenges really represent a sort of an intersection between virality and ephemerality. And there is also another aspect of TikTok specifically as a platform, but of short video content that we can find, for instance, on YouTube and Instagram more specifically. If we compare a platform like Instagram and TikTok and the kind of content that is available there, there is a fundamental difference between the image format and the short video format. And to some extent, the video format is more complex and also, I would say, less stable to analyze, less stable as compared to images. And this adds another level of ephemerality and temporality and uncertainty, especially for us researchers, if we want to make sense and analyze this type of content. So my argument here is that TikTok content can be considered ephemeral, not just because it disappears after a certain amount of time, because this is not the case, but because of the specificities of the platform's affordances, its embeddedness into the flows that are produced through the platform, and the personalized and algorithmically curated For You page that organizes how content is consumed on the platform itself. This is one of the arguments that I make in this book that you can see here. Is again a production of quite the same team of people and my colleagues from the University of Milan in Italy. It's titled "The Platformization of Consumer Culture: A Digital Methods Guide." And in a specific chapter about TikTok, I try to make this claim about ephemerality and connect it to practices of ephemeral consumption. And if you want, I invite you to read more, because again, this is also like a methods guide and not just a book on platformization that Thomas introduced before, or consumer culture. So that's a resource that might be helpful if you're interested in this type of topics. But then, all right, we can perhaps claim that ephemerality is related to algorithmically ranked content, and that we can see ephemeral content of TikTok. But then how does this look like on the app itself? And in the book, I present a case study that is based on this specific challenge that is called Shoe Challenge, and was popular around 2020, 2021 on the platform. And we can see from the data itself here, the ephemerality of this type of content. For instance, this bump chart here details exactly these peaks of content that I was mentioning, and showcases how the trend evolves over time. And particularly if you look at the light blue color, you can see precisely this peak that corresponds to one way in which the challenge was embodied and shared on the platform. And again, you see that it only lasts a couple of months, not more. And the same for the other sounds that are highlighted here. They only last for a certain amount of time, and then they slowly get diluted and they slowly disappear. And what is interesting that we found in our research is that with the particular sound associated to the challenge, of course, comes a specific, TikTok dance. And it's not just about the dance itself. It's about the type of content that is vehiculated and the type of template that is vehiculated, that is also very fleeting in time and very transient. And we can see a visual depiction of these videos here. And we can see in the first case that I call challenge replication is an example of how these specific challenge is embodied on TikTok in a, let's say, very standard way. The main aim of this challenge was to kind of showcase different pair of shoes and associate them to different events in real life. And this is exactly what can be seen here in this challenge replication. Users that mimetically reproduce the type of content that the challenge fosters. But at the same time, if we look at what happens later on, we can see that there are very, very different templates here. You can see that the second image that I called challenge alteration presents a different visual pattern. And again, these forms are, these images are related to the shoe imaginary again. But what is represented here is a display of multiple pairs of sneakers that has little to do with the original challenge. And so this is a good example to blend how the specificities of the platform and its affordances kind of orient the production of content and the dilution or alteration of challenges on TikTok, and therefore tell us something about the ephemerality of this phenomenon. And this particular example was also helpful for me to develop like a complementary argument in the book chapter, because this was helpful for me to describe some forms of consumption that happen on a platform like TikTok that, again, are a particular type of consumption because it goes a little beyond just buying and wearing shoes for, some the utility of it, right? But this content really showcases how consumption can be conceived in terms of display of consumption. So I own multiple pair of shoes in this case, not just because I need them, but because I want to maybe display them on the platform and participate in a trend, and ultimately perhaps also getting money out of this displays of consumer goods. And this, of course, leads to some to particular understanding of consumption beyond utility that has to do with the dimension of display, of consumption, that again is related to this ephemeral and viral nature of the platform that prompts the user to display more content, engage in more trends to get visibility, and also display more consumer goods. So, as I said, understanding this type of content raises some challenges, methodological challenges. Firstly, because it entails dealing with some content that disappears or that is really changeable and then fleeting on digital platforms, and then analyze some content that is also complex to understand because it is in a way multimodal, meaning that it blends the visual, but also the audio, but also the text and the stickers that we can see in short videos such as TikTok videos. And these are some of the texts that I've been using over the years for my research to combine different aspects and try to make sense of these challenges and try to analyze this type of content. So I come from obviously digital methods, but also digital methods combined with qualitative research that is ethnographic research and also participant observation in a way, or content analysis, and then a particular emphasis on visual methodologies, because yes, this is necessary when we are dealing with visual content such as the one that we can see on TikTok. And one of the ways in which I tried to make sense of these challenges and think of methodological ways of doing research is exactly starting from the types of visualization here, and especially the ones representing the shoes and the TikTok videos, and try to understand how can we make some methodological practices out of these visualizations, and how can we enrich a visualization that is mostly visual with the other elements of the platform, such as the sounds, such as the text. How can we account for everything, or everything, maybe it's too much, but how do we account for multiple elements? And so one of the contribution that I'm trying to make is trying to study TikTok content by looking at meta pictures. So try to dissect and then recompose TikTok videos in pictures about pictures. And therefore organize visual content in a way that allows a critical reflection and a critical interpretation on it. And at the same time to enrich this sort of meta picture with other elements, as I said, visual or textual or even gestural, that are peculiar of the medium and the type of content that we can see on a platform like TikTok. And this is an example of how we can understand and visualize a large collection of TikTok videos, and an example of how we conceive this form of meta picture and then how we can enrich it. This is an visualization from a research that I've conducted with some colleagues here at the University of Amsterdam instead. And it's a visualization of around 200,000 TikTok videos. And more specifically, the first frame of these videos. We collected some data by using data donations. So Thomas was previously mentioning that it's more difficult to access data. So we asked some donors to present us with the data that they collected while scrolling down TikTok. And I can elaborate more on this if you're interested in the questions Q&A. And we decided to visualize and understand, first of all, what is in these media diets, what is that students actually consume on the platform. And to do this, we decided to first fix this fleeting content and this large content within this form of a meta picture that, as I said, consists of the first frames of each video, with the assumption that if you scroll TikTok, maybe you don't look at the whole video, but you will see the first frame. And then we delved into the visual clusters, and we found out that a specific cluster was really interesting, and this was a representation of different female bodies, right? So we blend, in this case, a digital method approach of a large data set with a more fine-grained, in-depth visual analysis of content. And then we started from this small cluster and try to understand the content of the whole video and not just the first frame. And again, here we were able to find different templates and different ways in which this content is presented and consumed by users. And we were able to find that these original cluster that we identified as just female bodies was actually presenting different narratives about body acceptance, body transformation, and also, again, the dimension of displaying the same body. And by means of these so-called scene-by-scene timelines, we were able to visualize and interpret the content of these videos, and specifically a selection of these. And you can already see that from the previous version to this one, there is a smaller amount of data, and this step allows to go more in depth with exactly the content and the visual content of these TikTok videos, which led us to the conclusion that there are multiple ways in which the issues of body positivity and femininity are vehiculated on the platform itself. And we were able to see that, and by fixing this element, by exactly visualizing this type of content through these forms of images that select and recompose the videos in the different frames. I will briefly conclude by saying that these are just two examples of something that we've been experimenting with. I've been experimenting with myself, and the whole study of ephemerality helps us understanding that we can talk about ephemerality in a plural way, but also that is very important to keep in mind the role of the platform's architectures. And so again, affordances and algorithms in fostering different ephemeralities. And at a more methodological level, it's pivotal to keep in mind the tension of understanding the nature of this content that is constantly changing, and also the need for fixing and representing it in a way that allows us for its analysis. And again, account for the multimodality of content. And yeah, that would be all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucia, for your wonderful presentation. And we are gonna pass it on to Emilija in a bit. I'm just gonna introduce Emilija to everybody. So our next speaker is Emilija Jokubauskaite. I hope I pronounced it properly. I'm not sure, but hopefully. Yeah, so Emilija is a PhD candidate in sociology and media studies at the University of Amsterdam. Her current research analyzes webcam sex platforms as competitive socio-technical environments. Besides that, she is interested in developing and scrutinizing methods for studying marginalized online spaces and digital communities. Emilija is going to present us the talk, Algorithmic Visibility and Income on Webcam Sex Platforms. Emilija, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, the slides are already here. Great. I was just thinking, how do I start the slide? Thank you so much for inviting me to discuss my research with you. I am very excited. Let me just get a timer started so that I don't go too long. I will present my research focusing on webcam sex platforms, and without taking too much time, I'm just gonna already discuss with you what those webcam sex platforms are. So I'll briefly introduce. So here in the slides, actually, there should be 5 images changing, but I don't see them. So basically, I had 5 images changing, but here you see only 1, but this is a good example as well. So webcam sex platforms include performers streaming live shows, and usually they are sexual or erotic in nature. So some people know Twitch better as a platform, which is a mainstream platform for live streaming. And you can imagine webcam sex platforms being as kind of like a sexy Twitch platform. And why did I have 5 on here? So very interestingly, and differently from what Thomas was discussing in the introduction, within webcam sex industry, there's not one dominant platform. So there's quite a few of them. And I only had 5 of the most popular ones, or 5 popular ones, but there are many more. And performers can choose on which platform they stream, but also users obviously also choose where they go to consume this kind of content. So importantly also, these webcam sex platforms can be premium or freemium. So these are the 2 business models that they work by mostly. So that means that a performer may be streaming a live show for an audience and then collecting tips from viewers. That could be like Chatterbait that you see on the screen, my free cams, bongo cams, or they may be charging a fee per minute. So then you kind of see these performers and you choose which one. Usually they have a preview, and then you take them to a private show, and there you pay per minute. So those could be, for example, StreamMate or Live Jasmine. And as you can see on the screenshot, there's an important feature of these platforms, and it's also on other platforms as well, is that performer thumbnails are ranked on the homepage. So there are often thousands of performers streaming at the same time, but only some of the shows or some of the performers are in the most visible spots at the top of the page or on the first page of the platform. And obviously, the more visible you are, the more likely someone will click on your thumbnail, and the more likely they will tip you or take you to a private show. And this ranking order is algorithmically determined and based on various factors, but it's also a business secret and not uncovered to the workers or especially competitors, which for the workers creates very uncertain working conditions, but also for researchers creates obstacles in understanding how all of this works, right? So I will be talking about algorithmic visibility, and this is what I mean by algorithmic visibility, this kind of being visible at the top on the first page of these platforms. Let's see. So now that you know who I am and what I'm gonna presenting about, the rest of the presentation will be, first I will discuss main findings of one paper that's already published. So I'll only present a little sneak peek into that. And then I will talk a bit more in depth about another paper which is not published. So there's also a bit more to talk about here. And then I'll just conclude by some key takeaways. Let's see. So first, I will explain briefly the methods of my research. So the data collection and analysis I did together with brilliant colleagues, Sarah Burkhardt, Bernard Rieder, and Stein Peters. And this data was collected by scraping twice in 2 different time periods. So first, we scraped data on 5 different platforms for approximately 11 weeks. And there we focused on how these streams are ranked on the homepage, so where the algorithm places them, and then numbers of viewers that they had in shows. And here we scrape the homepage every half an hour. So obviously, also connecting to what Lucia was talking about, ephemerality, it really often changes who is on the top as well. And then later, on the right side of the slide, we collected Chatterbait data for 2 weeks. So just one platform, and conveniently, you also saw a screenshot of that platform before. And there, besides visibility data, we also had data on how much performers were making in terms of tips. So it's one of those freemium platforms where performers are being tipped, and we got the data on how much they were earning. And here we scraped every 2 minutes, which is much more granular than every half an hour. And so I will focus more of my time on this second part of the research. And also importantly, all of my research is informed by fieldwork, which I conducted at industry conferences, and then interviews that I conducted with industry insiders. So also connecting to what Thomas was talking about, doing interviews and next to digital methods, and Lucia was also talking about it just before me. So I will just move on straight away to the findings of this first bit of research, where we compare 5 platforms. And I put the reference to the paper. For those of you who want to learn a bit more about this part of the research, you can read the paper. So we divided these 5 platforms into these subgroups of premium and freemium platforms. And because we're already aware that there are these differences between these 2 platforms, so we also want to make sure that we care for that in the research. And first, I would like to pay attention to the size of the bubbles that you see on the screen, which represents how many active performers we counted in total over the 11 weeks. So even someone who streamed once for half an hour or a bit more than half an hour, they would be counted as one performer. And you can see that Chatterbait already really stands out. And on this platform, there were almost 200,000 performers streaming at least once in these 11 weeks. Whereas other platforms, they were kind of similar in size to one another. My free camps was the smallest one in terms of how many performers they had, which obviously also talks about turnover of performers. So maybe on some of these platforms, these performers stream very regularly, as opposed to maybe on Chatterbait, they're much more there's much more change. And second, let's look at the indicated slices of each pie chart. And these represent performers we called high visibility performers. So these performers appeared on the front page at least once during those 11 weeks. So we expect that they got the chance to attract attention at least for half an hour from a significantly larger audience than other performers who never appeared at the top in this algorithmically ranked list. And here again, we see that Chaturbate stands out because only below 3% of all of its performers ended up on the front page, which is very different, for example, on Live Jasmine, where an exact opposite happens, where almost a quarter of performers are landing on the front page. And we see that these platforms are representing these two different business models, and that could really be part of it. Also, the personalization of these ranking algorithms could play a part here as well. But this already suggests quite a lot about the competitive environment that these algorithmic ranking systems create. And next, what does it mean for the number of viewers in these shows of performers? And here we only look on those freemium platforms where it really matters how many viewers are watching the show and could be tipping. And obviously this is a dual relationship. So ranking on many freemium platforms is at least partly based on how many performers are in the show and how much money the show is generating at that moment. But on the other hand, better visibility on the platform also attracts more viewers. So it's really kind of feeding into one another. And there was a significant correlation between those variables on all three platforms. So the higher you were, the more viewers you had. The highest correlation was on My Free Cams, but also My Free Cams had the lowest number of viewers on the platform in total. So that also changes the dynamic a little bit. And when we start looking at the audience size on these freemium platforms, we see that Chaturbate is largest not only in terms of how many performers they had, but also in how many viewers they had online on average. So that's at the top of this table. So performers are kind of fighting over a really large number of viewers. But Bonga Cams had the best ratio of performers live to viewers live. So if we imagined a scenario where all viewers were divided equally to all performers, then each one would get the largest audience there on this platform specifically. But of course, viewers are not divided equally on any one of these platforms. So then we compared this ratio of viewers to performers on each platform, but between those performers that had high visibility, those that were on the front page at least once, and those that never landed there. And we saw that there are really large differences. So here you see that in the bottom two rows of the graph on the table, that the difference was especially immense on Chaturbate, where highly visible performers got on average 83 times more viewers in their shows than the rest. So really a big difference. And here's just a sneak preview to all the findings of this paper, but you can read the whole analysis in the paper if you're interested. And I will just move on to this other part of my research where we zoom in on this one specific platform, which is Chaturbate, in a bit more detail and talk about money as well, which is very important because there's never been findings about how much, there's never been large-scale data collected on how much these performers are making. And we often talk about visibility as almost kind of like a stand-in for income. So we assume that the more algorithmically visible shows will get more tips, but it does not always work like that in webcamming, especially on Chaturbate, because this platform is known for having many so-called freeloaders, viewers that go on a show and they just watch it and they never tip. And even the previous CEO has claimed that only 1 in 200 visitors tips, so really a small percentage. Well, we could not check that, how many of these users tip, but we got some insight into the income flows and tendencies on the platform. And I will talk about those. So just very briefly, this is how the interface looks once you're inside of a live stream, where you can enter and you can watch it for free. And then the performer will have all kinds of strategies to make you want to tip. So for example, they will usually have a tipping goal they're working towards. So let's say collectively, when everyone tips a specific amount, they will take their bra off. And the viewers are expected to tip towards that goal, or they can tip according to a tipping menu, which shows also here on the screen. You can see it. What happens if you tip a certain sum? And there in the chat, viewers can also just kind of chat with the performer, chat amongst themselves, and the tips are visible there as well. And this is where also we get the data of how much these performers are generating in terms of income. So we only see how much happens in tips. We don't see any other income that these performers may be generating from selling videos, for example, or selling other stuff. But very importantly, performers also tag these shows. So they provide hashtags. Here, I think you see them at the top of the screenshot, with kind of hashtags that are representative of the content of the show. And users can filter on those hashtags when they are on the homepage, which is important for the later part of my findings. So just to give you the scale of the income flows, in 2 weeks, we saw a total amount of more than 305 million tokens tipped. That means that the platform paid out about $15 million to its performers, but in total it collected between 24 and 33.5 million $, which if we were to extrapolate to a kind of like a yearly revenue, it would be between 624 and 871 million $. So that's really big sums of money floating around. And then we wanted to see how those $15 million got divided among performers. And of course, those tips were not equally divided. And the distribution was actually extremely skewed, as you can see in this graph, where the majority of performers were making nothing or almost nothing. Here I have another, representation of that, where it's kind of like a more zoomed in version of this distribution. And here we divided the performers into the top 25% of earners. And those performers we called significant earners. And they made at least $95 in 2 weeks, which in some countries might be a very small income, but in some countries it could be something that's like a good side income at least. And then so we looked at those top 25, which are on the right side of the graph, and then on the left is the rest of the performers. And inside those two groups, we had 5 smaller groups that are unequal in size. So for example, the very low income group, which is half of the performers, made between $0 and $11 in 2 weeks, which is very little. for half of the performers on the platform. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, in the highest earning group, the top 1% of earners, the sum of tips that they collected was between 1,600 and 20,000. So even in the top 1%, the variation was really huge in their earnings. And then we can observe that the top 10% of earners made more than 69% of all income. And then the lower half of earners made less than 1%. And we also observe differences in relation to self-selected gender categories, which are at the top of this graph. So even though overall on the platform, we saw that there are similar proportions of male and female performers, there were many more women in the group of significant earners. So male performers, really only a small group of them made a significant amount of money. And then we wanted to look at this relationship between average ranking position, audience size, and tips collected. So on the left, you see the full performer population. And on the right, we zoom in on those top 25%, those significant earners. And the tendencies here are quite straightforward and not surprising. So the better ranking you are, the higher you are on the page, and the larger audiences you have, the more money you make. But we were curious about these kind of, if you see in these graphs, these mid-density areas in the middle of the square, especially in graphs lettered B and D. So those performers who made a significant income, but they did not appear on the front page ever, and they often did not have large audiences. And we were curious what was happening there. And I will tell you. At least a part answer to that. So to explore this further, we made this network visualization where each kind of a node that you see is a performer, and the node size is their hourly tips. And the nodes are closer, the more common tippers the performers have. So if two performers had a lot of common tippers, they would be almost really close to one another. And this is only those performers who had a significant income in this graph. And then here, the nodes in gray are those that had what we call this mainstream algorithmic visibility. So they appeared on the front page at least once. And most of them are in the middle, they're strongly interconnected, and they made large amounts of money hourly. So if you were at the top of the page, you were making a lot of money and you're all kind of interconnected. But we were more curious about the pink nodes in this graph. So those performers who did not appear on the front page, and they still made significant amounts. And since everyone in this graph made at least $95 in total, but some of the pink nodes represent quite large hourly income. And these performers, we argue, had some sort of an alternative visibility. So it may be connected to them having large social media followings and linking to their shows from there, which is a common practice. Or they may be discovered by filtering for tags on the platform, because some of these tags that they use are really niche. And I've indicated some of them in kind of like small clusters around the graph. I don't know if it's visible right now, but yeah, so some of them are really niche, and some users really look for that kind of niche content, and that makes these performers much more visible, even though they never appear on this mainstream first page. And then we also wanted to understand the income flows better by looking at the number of people that donated to these performers. So in online sex work, whales is a well-known phenomenon. In sex work generally, such clients are often called regulars. And in freemium webcamming, these are users that tip large amounts of money to one performer. So we wanted to see if these performers, the top 25% of earners, if they are dependent on these big tippers, whale tippers. So among those people, those performers, we considered a whale to be someone who tipped at least 20% of that performer's income. And so a performer could have up to 5 whales. And then we considered a performer to be a whale dependent if at least half of their income came from whales. So in that situation, if one of them stops paying you, you lose quite a big chunk of your money. And looking at the proportion in this graph, we saw that among those with alternative visibility, so those who are pink, more than 35% were whale dependent. So those are in bright pink in the graph. And almost 40% of their income came from these tippers, which is very different for performers who appeared on the front page at least once. So if they had front page visibility, only about 11% were whale dependent, and only about 16% of their income came from these whale tippers. Yeah, and just to kind of wrap up, the main takeaways, at least from what I present today, is really that there is this skewed visibility and income distribution on these platforms. So we see especially skewed visibility on different platforms, and then we see the skewed income distribution on Chaturbate. But these winner-take-all tendencies vary among platforms as well. So it kind of depends on which platform you choose to work on and how the specific algorithms rank your show on a specific platform. But performers, importantly, find ways for alternative visibility. So they find, their niche, they find a way to make income even without appearing on the front page, which might be very complicated. And not every performer actually wants to be on the front page, because in sex work, not everyone wants to be so visible. But very importantly, performers remain always dependent on something. So they're either dependent on this algorithmic ranking system, which could, one day change, and they would end up not being on the front page anymore, and maybe not getting so many viewers and not making those large sums of money. But on the other hand, if they had this alternative visibility, then they are dependent on these large tippers, who also could just one day not tip them anymore, and would also take away a big chunk of their income. So that's from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilija, for your fantastic presentation. So now you're going to have like 10-15 minutes for questions. And I'm going to start just asking my questions. I think for both of you. The first thing that I would like you both to expand a little bit is about the challenges to gather all this data that you gather, especially considering that they change over the time. And in your case, Emilija, specifically, this is kind of like a sensitive data, let's say. So if you can, each of you just expand a little bit more on the challenges that you had to gather the data and analyze the data, and then obviously get your findings.
Lucia, do you want to?
No, you can go, Emilija, so you can finish with your presentation.
Yes, so there was a lot of challenges, definitely, in conducting this research. So I worked with really brilliant colleagues, and all of them had data collection kind of computational background. So this is actually where most of their contribution came to this research. This is, first of all, in terms of like complications in collecting this data, this is ephemeral data in the, coming back to what Lucia was talking about. And it took us really a long time to figure out how to collect that and how to, first of all, we thought of ways of sampling it. We thought of ways of, is it technically possible? Is it, all kinds of questions, but also very importantly, the ethical concerns. So in sex work research, more broadly, collecting data without a sex worker's permission would be considered really unethical. But then in this case, we really had to kind of ask ourselves, what is more beneficial to these workers? This is a really, as you can see, this is a really big group of people doing this kind of work. And there's very little knowledge about how platforms govern this kind of work, how they create these competitive environments, and all of the things that performers actually don't know when they start working on these platforms, and they have to really search for it, and it's really complicated. And yeah, it was really this kind of trying to decide and kind of navigate between the two, of being extremely sensitive with the data, being extremely careful, but also bringing the benefits and trying to do the research that would be useful to the community. And that, to maybe briefly explain how we did that, was we really store data in very few copies. It's only on encrypted servers and computers, and is extremely confidential. We never present anything. We never pick out anything about specific performers. We only present this kind of aggregated data, just to make sure that it's never traceable to one specific performer. Yeah, I think, I don't know, maybe there's more, but there's for sure more. But for now, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Emilia. Yeah, I mean, also in my case, how we collect the data and what are the challenges. I have a similar story to the one of Emilia, and also what Thomas was mentioning before, because especially for the second case study about TikTok media diets, it was really a joint effort. We used some data for a paper that is in review. We used this data that was collected in the context of a broader project, and that we were allowed to reuse for our research as well. And that specific project used data donation. So basically in the European Union, there is a EU mandate that is a sort of data request feature of TikTok. And so you can request the personal data that TikTok holds on you. And we asked 6 donors to do this request and then share the results with us, not with me directly, but with my colleagues. And so this is what we call a data donation. Obviously, there was ethical agreement by the participant before. So there was also that step involved. But I guess this is also a new way of sourcing data in a moment where, again, access to API is not that easy to get. And so, yeah, asking people to, again, look at what they serve. And especially in this research, we were really interested in, like, okay, if we have to look at what content is recommended by the algorithm in relation to perhaps body related issues, what it is that some actual users encounter and consume on the platform. So this was also particularly relevant for my research and for our research. So accessing the data is in itself a challenge, I would say. And then for me, I think what for the book, the data set and the research was like the data set was less big, and so it was not very problematic. For the other research, the other challenge is visual and audiovisual interpretation is not that easy at some point, right? Also, Thomas was mentioning the specificities and the vernaculars and the specific languages that users use on the platform. And when it comes to the visual, there is also another layer there, because what I can interpret in a certain way might not be reflective of another interpretation from another researcher or what the users meant there. And then when you have a lot of visual data, how do you make sense of that? So this is also why we try, together with my colleague Stan Peters, we tried to come up with some methods to do that, because when you have one big wall of images, then how do you make sense of that? That was the first challenge, and that is the core of our piece that I hopefully will be available soon. It's how do you do that? Yeah.
Thank you. And just to wrap this up, I think Carol has a question for you. Yeah, so I'm going to pass it on to Carol.
Thank you both for the brilliant presentations. I have a question for both of us, actually, because you are using a mix of methods. You talked more today about the quantitative part of it, but if you can explore more how you are using other methods, because, for example, Lucia talking about ethnography and content analysis and things like that. And I would like to know how you are using this. And for Lucia, if you can talk more about the meta picture, because I find it really nice. I didn't know about it, but if you can talk more, I think it would be nice for us to hear more about it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Shall I go first? So yeah, I mean, my approach to digital methods is very informed by qualitative research. I'm for full disclosure, I'm a sociologist by training, so that's where I come from. And for me, it's really important. That's also why I wanted to show that the two types of visualization, right? The big visualization first, and then the second one was which was more of selection of posts, because for me, it's important to sketch the big picture, and digital methods help us doing that. And then I use digital methods very much as a way to sampling case studies and sampling subset of data that then I can analyze qualitatively. So in this specific type of research that I've showed today, I've used digital methods and the principle of following the medium, so following the hashtags and using hashtags or other metadata to select a specific subsample of, for instance, topics related to gender issues that I can then delve more into with content analysis, visual content analysis is in the case of the research. But then again, I'm consciously I'm always doing that. Like once I draw the broad picture, then I go and delve deeper into that. And the meta picture in this sense is unhelpful heuristic to me, because the meta picture itself, it really means a picture about pictures, right? And for me, it's a very powerful metaphor and methodological tool, because sometimes and I think this is maybe something that Emilija also can relate to, we have a lot of data and we have to come up with a way of presenting it in a way that is readable, but also that allows us to interpret the data at the same time. So creating a visualization is never just the final stage of the process, is a process in itself. And to me, is really a way of doing the analysis. Like when I prepare the visualization that you see, I am analyzing the data. And so this is, a more, like, say, operationalized way of using the meta picture. It's not just pictures about pictures, but it's more a way of doing research with visuals, with visualizations if you're not using images. And in the case of TikTok, I didn't have the time to go very much in depth, but we're also experimenting in ways of, one of the examples that I showed has the images of the videos and aside the text of embedded at the visual level, because it's interesting that on a platform like TikTok, sometimes what you see and what you read convey different meanings, and users convey irony and, alter the content, the meaning of their videos by, mixing the visual and the text. And so if you integrate the visual and the text, or the visual and the audio within the same visualization that is an interpretative tool, then you can get a better grasp on the data and answer the research question.
Yeah, I think for me, incorporating qualitative work was extremely important, especially I think because it is such a sensitive online area, and not only online. It's just sex work is something to be handled very carefully. And qualitative work, qualitative research really allowed me to bring this context into it, and to make sure that, I'm understanding things the way they should be understood, and especially because I don't have experience in this work. And a lot of the researchers who do sex work research, they have been sex workers themselves. But it also played a really important part for me in just kind of finding the information that is nowhere to be found, because these platforms are extremely secretive. If you start looking for the name of the company that owns one of these platforms, you will have to go through layers and layers and layers of different companies owning different companies that end up usually somewhere in Cyprus or in some other location where they can, where tax the situation is more beneficial for their business, let's just put it that way. And for me, so I started during COVID, and I could not go to these industry events in the beginning. And first research that I did, kind of a pilot study, was really without going to any of these events, not really meeting people from the industry. I did some interviews online, but it was just not that much. And sometimes when I look back on that research that I did online, I see how little I knew back then, and how much I learned during field work, talking to the people who work in the industry. And by talking to the people who work in the industry, I also mean not just the performers, but people who actually, develop these algorithms, who run these platforms, who manage these performers, who run performer studios, who run payment provider companies, and all of these kinds of third parties in the industry, which is it's just a lot to learn, and you can only learn it from people. So I'm very happy that I got to do both.
So thank you once again, Emilija and Lucia. We are going to wrap this session of the seminar. We have another one soon, and we are tight on time, but thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and for sharing with us the whole structure of your research and the main findings. So now, Issaaf, you have the mic.
Thank you, Lucia and Emilija, for being with us today. And switching to Portuguese, obrigada a todo mundo que está na audiência, participando com a gente. A gente vai para a nossa mesa de encerramento, mas a gente vai para um link novo. Na verdade, a gente tem um link aqui programado no próprio canal do YouTube do GP, que vocês já conseguem olhar ali. É só entrar no canal do GP, Tecnologias, Culturas, Digitais, tem ali um ao vivo programado para a gente ir para a nossa mesa final, com o João e a Júlia, que vão falar em português, também sobre métodos digitais. Então fica aqui o convite para a gente seguir todo mundo juntos aqui. Mais 5 minutinhos a gente já entra lá. E agradecer muito a presença de todo mundo aqui, gente. Professores que estão com a gente, alunos que estão com a gente. É uma alegria saber do interesse de todo mundo nesse tema de métodos digitais, que seja o primeiro evento de muitos. E fiquem com a gente. So, thank you very much for everyone that was with us. We're gonna reach to the final part of this event at another link that is already here on YouTube channel of TCDIG. So wait for us there and we'll finish our event today together. Thank you so much and see you in a couple of minutes. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Obrigada.
Okay, are we live?